Hi everyone and welcome to this quick start into Redshift. This will get you up and started in Redshift with area lights. We'll go through some sample settings to get rid of the noise, some shader settings, and we'll also take a quick look at the Redshift render view. So on this page, we're going to be using a little bit of Zoo Tools to teach with. This is completely optional and you can go to our site and buy that for just $10. But if you aren't using our tools, then you can easily follow along this tutorial too. We show you where all the attributes and how they match up. Also be sure to check out the official page for this tutorial. It's got a lot more notes. The videos are divided up a little bit more clearly. And you can also download the model for free. So check that out. Now this video will give you an introduction into Redshift. So this is a quick start guide. Getting up and going, we're going to talk a little bit about just getting nice renders out of Redshift, creating some lights, putting a little bit of shader information, and just some basic render settings to get you started in Redshift. So let's get going. Now, the first thing that you should know about loading Redshift is it's best to switch Arnold off. So if you do have Arnold on, it comes with Maya. Come into your plugin manager, that is Control-3. And just make sure that Maya to Arnold M2A is not on auto load. Now, if it is, switch auto load off and then restart Maya. So that will mean that it's not loaded. And up here, what happens is Arnold puts extra attributes on all your objects. It's really annoying if you're using another renderer that's not Arnold. So make sure that that is off. Now, to load Redshift, you just have to find Redshift here and make sure it's loaded. So I'll also keep it auto loaded off and then only load it when I need it there. So load it up and you'll find it in the menus here. Now in the light manager or shader manager or whatever, you can load via that way. So you just go down to Redshift and hit the load button. That will load that up as well. So now that we're here ready to get started, the main thing that we need to do is come into Redshift here and we've got our render view. So all the renderers these days have their own render views. We're moving away from having this one here, which is the default Maya one. Each renderer sort of handles its own renderer a bit better by having its own window. Okay, so for Redshift, there are a few things that we should know just straight away, and open up the render settings and we can have a look at this. Make sure that if we are in My Software that we switch that down into Redshift. These are our settings and we'll just go through a few things here. So by default, it will probably be on IFF. So just switch that over to OpenEXR there. Now on your compression, I usually use PLZ. That's a good one. That'll work in After Effects and Nuke, no worries. So we've got that now. 16-bit color, that's what we want straight away. Coming down a little bit more, this is our render resolution here, and this is more important than in other renderers. We can switch this over to 1080p, that's full HD, and I'll explain a little bit about this and how it works in the render view in a second. That will sort of set it to YouTube HD resolution or Vimeo. And usually in this little Ask MISC area here, I'll switch the enable default light to be off. I'll show you what that is now. We can come into Redshift render view and we can hit render now, and that will be rendering it at full HD because we've got that rendering. But what that does is we've got no lights in the scene, but it's just creating a light for us. So by switching that off and then just hitting refresh on that, we'll render it black, and that's sort of a bit of a better way of working. If you have no lights, it just goes black. Now, the next thing that we should have a look at over here is GI. By default, Redshift does not have any GI in the scene. So what that means is when we hit render with our light, there'll be no bounce light. So it's a good idea just to switch that onto brute force. That sort of matches the other renderers. Now in Redshift, I find that the secondary GI, at least on simple scenes, is really, really quick and fast. So I'll often switch that on and put both brute forces on it. I really like that. In Redshift, it gives us a little bit more bounce light in comparison to the other renderers for very little overhead for simple scenes at least. Now there's quite a lot to GI in Redshift. You can use a lot of different settings, but these are like the dumb no-brainer ones there, and we generally don't touch those. You can go a long way with just having those sort of simple settings there. So that's a good just straight away setup. Usually you'll see me always in Redshift coming on and switching those guys on at the very least when I'm rendering. Now let's just create some lights. So Redshift is here. If we want to create an area light, it is just the Redshift physical light. But it's probably a little bit better to use the light manager. This is what it's for. And we can come in here and we've got to have Redshift up there, and we can go create from camera and then create an area light. So that means that we've created that area light there. Good default settings straight away. So now when we come back here, we can start a session and we're rendering away. Now there is no fancy navigation mode yet in Redshift as per this, but we can sort of zoom up there with the window and we've got pretty good results there. So I'm just going to create a plane for the ground as well. And there is some bounce light coming down and then up again from that area light now too, because we've switched that bounce light on. Now, one thing to know about Redshift is we're currently rendering at 50% scale. Now, no matter what you've got set here and no matter what you've got set down here in the zoom settings, you're always rendering at 100%, but you're just sort of doing a Photoshop zoom in and zoom out. So what that means is we can stop this now and we're going to come to 100%. And you know, we have got full quality. We're not rendering half res like the other renderers. So it's a good idea to remember, if we do want to render at half res, to actually do that with the render settings, Shift 5, and we can come in and to the common here, switch that back to 540 physically there if you do want to actually be rendering smaller. Redshift being a very fast renderer, usually I don't worry too much about this, especially because I've got 4 GPUs in the machines for the simple scenes. But if you are worried about render times and you do want to do some testing, make sure that you set that there. Don't just rely on the 50% window there. It does not actually render at 50%. Remembering that when you're rendering at a half a res, like half the res of 540 would be this big, you are actually rendering a quarter the amount of pixels, meaning that your renders will be 4 times faster, or roughly. It's all pretty easy from here. We can move around and update that light. No problems there. Everything else is fairly self-explanatory. Here in Redshift, a very fast renderer if you've got good GPUs in your box like I do, and we can do that there. If you want that to be a little bit brighter, just up the exposure on that. I think I did actually create that a little bit brighter. The default is 12, which is a little bit dim. I use exposure here. The exposure, Redshift does now have an exposure setting, and just because of version 2 has only just come out, I'm still converting all the exposure to intensity. But I will switch that over at some stage so that when you hit exposure there or go into this guy here, it's sort of better to work with exposure, and I explain that in the exposure versus intensity video. Otherwise here, one of the most annoying things about this render view is that if you do have a camera in the scene, so I'm just going to go Shift K and create a camera, come into the camera here and sort of move around. This lock button becomes really important because now when we're here, as soon as you've got that lock button off, we can zoom in and then come in here and then think that we're cool. And as soon as we switch back into the perspective window, this is an odd thing that Redshift does. We're now annoyingly back in the perspective window, even though we might be just using our perspective window to shift the lights. So the way that you work it in Redshift is you go to the camera one and then you hit the lock button. You got to sort of make sure it updates, and then you just hit the lock button. Now with that lock button on, when we come back into our perspective window, we're now kind of good to go. So that's pretty easy and a good way of doing, just remember that lock button there. Now, since we're using the Zoo Light Manager and the Zoo Shader Manager in this tutorial, I thought I'd just show you guys how all the attributes match up. So this is just opening the attribute editor with the light selected and seeing where these attributes match up if you are not using our tools. Our tools do not change anything that's not in Vanilla Maya, so if you were to save out the file and go to another computer without our tools, everything will load absolutely fine. Now with Redshift, everything matches up really nicely. All of the light settings work here, and you'll be able to see how that works there. Now we'll have a look at the Redshift material and how that matches up as well. And everything is pretty good in Redshift as well for this one. Everything matches up nicely. We've got weights on everything, got specular weights, specular colors, and things like that. So specular IOR, you can see where that goes. Just make sure that Fresnel type is on IOR. Same with the coating layer. This is the clear coating layer. You can see where those attributes go there. Just our interface makes it a little bit nicer and cleaner to access those guys there. Okay, now what will happen with Redshift is you'll always get good renders if you just wait long enough. Now by default, what happens in Redshift, and I think I might have even changed this already in this session, but your passes will be set to 1024. So that's a lot of samples. Okay, so when you hit render, you'll see down here, it is actually rendering it. It does take quite a while to get to that sort of fully finished render. And in the later versions of Redshift, you will see the time pop up here. It should actually be appearing here, but I think there's a little bug in this version of Redshift. I have definitely used the later versions and it pops up here. But if you do not see anything here and you're using an older version of Redshift, then to get your render times, you do actually have to open the script editor and you can find it down here. So that took 6.3 seconds to finish that render, which is really overkill for what this scene is. It's certainly not needing to take that long. So come up here in the output, I'm just going to show you, this is a really sort of like a very easy sort of setting to do here. It's just to type something like 32 and now we'll hit render and you'll see that's now taken, you know, a crazy short amount of time, like 0.2 of a second to finish that render, and it's a little bit noisy, but it's pretty good. So this setting here, if you set that generally to something like 128, that's going to be okay for these simple scenes. and it's going to render very quickly. That one, I'll just read it out. It took 2 seconds. It's a really nice clean render, pretty good sort of settings here. So what you've got to remember with Redshift is there's 2 different modes. There's the actual progressive rendering mode, which is this play button, is that guy there. That is what you're doing when you're progressively rendering. All the times you're using this settings, which is really only one slider, okay? And there's no real optimization happening. It's just brute forcing everything. It's actually not a very well optimized render when you're thinking about times. Now, when you come down here into the min and the max samples, this one here is the bucket rendering thing. And the way that you know that you're bucket rendering is when you hit this guy here. That will go through and you'll see the buckets kind of rendering. I'm going to move around so we can see that a bit more clearly to a different angle, and I'm going to take the lock off. And you'll see that that bucket rendering is, you can see that each bucket gets drawn as a little square and it builds that image that way. Now this is a far more optimized way of going, especially when you've got long render times. You do want to always be rendering in that mode. It optimizes everything. This mode here is the one that uses all the sampling overrides and all the sample settings, and you get into the niceness of all the tweaks that you can do here. But a good one to sort of remember here, a good sort of rule of thumb, easy rule of thumb, is to just multiply these double each time. So this is always a quarter of this value. So if we go to something like 256 here, then this one wants to be a quarter of that, which would be 64. So it's just a good idea to sort of go up in quarters as a really sort of a no-brainer rule of thumb. Now when we hit render, we're going to get rid of this noise, okay, and we're going to have a nice sort of a render. And the render times, they're a lot faster than if we're using this up here for the same quality. That's a good thing to remember. I'm not going to get into adaptive threshold, but basically the smaller number, the longer and better quality it is. I'll leave that for another class. No-brainer, kind of get started quickly. They're the ones you want to know for better quality there. This is what happens when you batch render. That's the guy that you're using, not that one. Now, if you do want to use progressive render for batch rendering for whatever reason, you can enable that. And what enable means is now when we hit this button, we're actually using that button. So you can actually batch render in progressive mode. You'll see it sort of kicking in there very quickly. This is such a light scene for my machine. You can hardly see it working. But that now with enabled on is ignoring this and purely rendering this even when you hit the sort of the final frame render button. So you can render in progressive if you want to, but that's generally not what you'd be wanting to do. You generally want to hit that one there, which is the much faster render type when we're doing final frames. Now, generally when you're previewing, you will be using this one because that's the one that has the nice updates. If we're to change colors or lights or whatever, you just want to leave that running. Generally, I will switch that down so it doesn't, render forever. I've got 4 GPUs and my machine can get hot. They start to sort of the fans kick in, so I like to switch that down from 1024, which is a bit overkill. Like you just render and render for no real reason. Your machine's working at full and it probably doesn't have to for a simple scene. I think that's all I really want to show for the basics. There's some cool denoiser stuff down here, and there's a bunch of cool stuff that you can get into with Redshift. If you are used to Arnold, you're coming from Arnold and you want to get into your sampling overrides, that's what this is. Just I'll point that out, but you got to switch them on. Generally, you don't really have to get too much into this until you're getting like really into optimizing your render times. Unlike Arnold, where you sort of like straight away you have to set individual settings for your specular and your refraction settings and your diffuse and whatnot. If you are coming from Arnold in Redshift, you can switch this light here, and there are samples overrides as well. So you've got sampling overrides on your lights too, so you can up those if you want to. But generally, I found I do that a little bit, but it's not quite as extreme in Arnold. With Arnold, you usually straight away change your sampling of your lights as soon as you start. With Redshift, it's a little bit smarter in the way that it works. So that's a good sort of overview of the sampling of Redshift and getting that up and going. And now let's have a quick look at changing some shaders, see how that works. So to change the shaders, let's just load the shader manager here. Now to create a shader in Redshift, we're always going to be using 95% of the time the Redshift material. This is the main Redshift material. That's the one that you use for most shaders in this program. So I'll select the mesh, big heavy mesh from ZBrush, and we'll right click down here and we'll go down to assign new material. Now in this window, we can come to the Redshift shader window there. And then the one that we want is this one here. It's the Redshift material shader. That's the one that we would assign by default. So you click on that and then that's going to have assigned it. There it is, and we can start tweaking that shader. Now I'm just going to undo that. You can see that it's sort of popping up there with a little bit of specular on it. A better way of doing this is just to use the shader guy here, and we're just going to do it this way. So to assign a shader, we just open the shader manager, come to the shader manager, just click on the object and just go create. That has created a Redshift shader now. You'll see it change. There it goes. And it's a bit darker because the Lamberts are light. This is a 50% gray matte shader with no specular on it by default. So whenever I'm changing these guys here, you can just see what it's changing down here. Right down into the coding is this area here is down here. And this shader is just a simplification of this interface. So I'll get more into this in later classes, but just as a quick heads up, when you select your object, to select the shader, a good hotkey to remember is Control Shift and N, and that will just select the shader that's related to that object and bring it up here and deselect the object. So now we're sort of working on the shader here. Now, if we want to change a color, let's just change this guy here to a red. We've now changed that and it's going to update nice and quickly there in those settings. Okay, so very easy to change stuff. Now, the spec weight, this is like a plastic. So if we were to go back to say quite a dark kind of a gray, if we want to put some plastic shaders on, this is a really quick overview of shaders. Just switch the specular weight on. Now the default is plastic, and you can see that plastic sort of kicking in there, giving it a plasticky sort of feel to that shader. The roughness is how rough that plastic will be. Now, if you have an IBL in the scene, the reflection stuff will work better. Remembering that specular is just another word for reflection. And we can come into roughness and we can up that to something like 0.4, and we can now see that we've got a lot more sort of specular roughness happening on that. What that means is it just means that the surface is a little bit rough and it's not quite so shiny. Okay, so there it is. Now, if you want to change the plastic color to anything, of course, it's just our diffuse color. Come back up here and we can switch that back to red at any time to get our red plastic back. Now, this interface is all based on selection, so that didn't update. So we just select the actual dragon and then just hit push all, and that will update this back to these settings. So there's a red dragon, and then we've got like blue dragons and stuff like that. So that's plastic, and roughness is the important one. Now, most shaders that aren't metals, just leave the specular IOR, if you're not very familiar with this, to 1.5. Okay, anything that's not a metal, 1.5 is a good safe bet. There are some different specular settings. Water is 1.3, crystal 2. There is a bit of variation in this, but a good no-brainer is 1.5. Just leave it unless you're doing a metal. Now, if we are doing metals, the diffuse color is always black. So switch that down to nothing and you're going to see that the black goes away. And then up that specular IOR to start at 4. So something like 4, you can see that's now starting to feel much more like metal. Okay, and the higher we go, all the way up to something like 20, is going to be a very, very shiny, almost chrome or mirror-like reflectivity. If you want a really shiny surface, of course, we just switch that roughness down to 0. That means it's going to be very, very shiny. Now, if we had an IBL in the scene, it would actually reflect that a lot better. I can show you that very, very quickly in the light manager by just adding a sky dome light. Any sky dome light will do. And that's now reflecting that as a really chrome sort of a shader. So I just thought I'd show you that there. Let's delete that guy and come back. That's the chrome shader there. Now, if you do want to have more of a gold kind of a shader, just change that specular color. Now, gold is sort of like this very sort of mid-range saturation, yellowy orange, something like that, and apply that. Now, if it's not applying, you do have to select the object and just hit push, which is the all button there. And we can see that we've got gold now on that object. So it's very easy to use that. If you want that gold to be a bit rough, remember the black, we've got no IBL in the scene. It's like the chrome. Just put that up to like 0.5 or something like that, and we're going to have a much rougher kind of a gold. It's like the surface is rough to touch. Will work that way. Now, if you want a sort of more of a muted gold, not so shiny, you can bring that down as low as 4, and sort of gets towards brass and stuff like that. Brass, you could sort of edge it towards orange a little bit more. So a range between 4 and 20, 20 being very shiny and 4 being kind of a dull metal, is a good one to remember for specular IOR. Now, if we do want to make a car paint shader, it's quite easy. We just come up to a red on that, and I might bring the spec up to something medium, like a 12, so that we've got sort of like this is like a Mustang red car paint base layer. What happens with car paint is like a rough metal underneath, and then it has like a glass polish on top. So that's what the clear coat is for here. Now, to switch the clear coat on, by the way, specular weight, that's just like switching all of these values on or off. So we switch that to 0, you're just basically switching all this section off. Okay, so just remember that. Now this here is identical to here. So if we were to put all these values into here and switch this one off, it would look identically the same. But clear coat is generally not used as your base specular weight. It's more used as a clear coat polish kind of a thing. So if I'm to switch this on to 1, we're now adding the nice shininess of the polish layer of a car paint, and you could put that up to 0.1 or something like that just to give it a little bit of roughness so it's a bit more real. Usually things aren't perfectly shiny. So that's like got a nice kind of a shininess to it. And we can see that if we were to move that light around a bit, make it smaller, and you can see it's going really quite shiny in there, depending on the scale of that light. So that's a car paint shader there, and you could change that color of the car to whatever you wanted. It could be a green car. Remembering that this will only update when you've got the selection, so we'll just push it, and we've got a green kind of a car paint there. So that's really only for if you want the clear coat polish is this guy. I would just leave that off. Usually you don't do anything else. You usually leave that to 1.5, usually leave that at white, usually you leave that a fairly low number so it's not too shiny for clear coat there. But that's a good understanding of shaders, just a good one. Now we've also got the presets up here. So with your object selected, or if you hit Control-Shift-N, the shader selected, we can just hit down in this area here, and that will just toggle through different types of shaders, some standards. That's only changing these numbers here. So very simple stuff at the moment, but you've got some nice presets there. The gold, really, that gold should be a little bit more down. It's a bit of a fake gold. That's more of a real gold. But I'll tweak some of these settings. Metal dull, dull metal polish, plastic mid black, plastic red. So we've got a whole bunch of different shaders that you can look at there and have a play around with and just see what those settings are doing. So that's a nice introduction into Redshift. That should give you a really good starting sort of point. If you want to go back to the matte gray and just reset that preset, there we go, just a matte gray. Very nice renderer. Redshift, very fast, super fast renderer to use. I really love it. So there you go, starting there in Redshift. Okay guys, let's get started on this scene with the dragon, and we're just going to light it all nicely and do the whole workflow of getting a still image out. So let's get started. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to render it in a Redshift. So if we come into a Redshift here, load that up. This is just loading the plugin. Give it a bit of time, and you'll see that it loads up here, goes, and we're ready to go. So if we want to put a light in, just sort of come up somewhere here. You can go a bit close. And then we just create a light from the camera, and we've got a rough light there. Now, if I'm going to sort of pre-rehearse this, so I'll put it roughly in the place that I want it, somewhere kind of there for starters. That's about good enough. Now, if we come to the channel box, we'll just make that a tiny bit smaller at 40 centimeters by 40 centimeters, and that's a good starting point. Now, the next thing is we should set up a few render settings in Redshift. So let's go there, and GI, just always switch the brute force on. So that's just the bounce light kicking in, and we're going to switch that down to 128. And for the min and max samples, let's start at 128, and we want to go a quarter of 128, so that would be 32. Now this is actually pretty good settings for the final render, but that's probably a pretty good starting point for most of your scenes. Come into common, and we'll go EXR. This stuff doesn't matter too much unless you're rendering out, but I usually put it at PLZ, and we can put the resolution at 1080p. But a bit of an easier way of doing that is right click and go 1080p on the cam icon. That actually sets up a number of things on the camera, not just this. It sort of does a batch of everything, but that's now set that to 1080p. Now, if we click that off, that's just a scene-wide thing. We actually need a camera in the scene. So we're done with the render settings for now, and we'll just go Shift K for camera, builds a camera, and that actually puts it with a nice gimbal rotation order as well. And we just get that somewhere and click on this. Now, when you click on this, it's actually making that window really nice. Cameras by default in Maya aren't set up particularly great, so that does a bit of stuff in the back end, but it won't change the resolution now that we've set it once with the right click. And if we go to focal length, just type in 80 there. This just gives us a bit of a longer lens on this guy, and we can click on this little icon. This is great in Maya. Center the dragon where we want him, somewhere like that. So we're pretty much ready to render. If we're going to come into the render view now, we can come in and we can take off the lock icon and just press play. That will start it rendering. The first time, this is a very heavy geo. It takes a little bit of time, but once it's loaded that into RAM, everything's going to be very fast from that point on. Now, Redshift is a really fast renderer, so 50% is not actually making it smaller. It's just like a 2D zoom out in Photoshop. This is our full HD render, and we're rendering, so we can see that there. Now, we can start to come in here with the light manager now and select that light, which will be in here, and just start to boost it up a bit brighter. And we can use either the exposure or the intensity. But one of the things that I'd like to point out here is that this has just got Lamberts on it, and the Lambert is actually quite a light gray. So let's put some shaders on this and just get it into a bit of a better place. So we can load up the shader manager here, create and manage shaders, and we want to create the background Studio Silke, and we're just going to call this background. and we can create a new shader there. And you'll see that that's gone quite a lot darker. That is a 50% gray in sRGB color space. So I prefer to start from that sort of a point. So we can just select these two guys. In fact, I'll just select this skin and I'll show you a little trick here. We just go dragon skin and we'll create that shader. And that's putting a redshift material on this guy here. And you can see how much darker that 50% gray in sRGB is from the Lambert, which is actually quite light. Now, if we want to transfer this new shader that we just created and actually assign it to this one as well, it's actually pretty easy to do. If we select that mesh there and then shift select the teeth, we can just go transfer, and that's going to transfer that onto the teeth, and we're pretty good. So the last thing that we need to do is put a shader on the eyes. So I just select the eye area and then deselect this area, and you'll see that the eyes are still selected. And now we can just go drag an eye and create a shader on it, and it'll be the last one. And everything's basically the same settings now, but we've got 3 shaders set up in our scene and we're ready to go. So now that we've got that a little bit better, now we can hold down shift. I'm getting a warning here. That just means that I should select the light. Area lights do not automatically get selected. So I'm just brightening that up quite a bit. That might be a little bit too much. Now, I've done this scene before, so I'm just going to type in 30300. That's actually the intensity that I had, and we're at a good sort of rough intensity for this scene. So we're really almost done on this scene. And the last thing that we need to do is just do a couple of little shader things. So if I close that window there and then come into the shader manager, we can come in here and we're just going to edit some of these shaders on this model. So I can now lock that render view in Redshift here, and that means that it just won't move into the perspective when I start navigating around here. And we can select this guy here. Now Control Shift and N will select that shader there, the Redshift material that we created earlier. But we can just come in now and edit this shader. So if we pull it all in, that's sort of like what this shader is currently doing now. And we want to switch on the spec weight. Now, what I like to do is, if we can see that sort of popping up, because we've got the dragon skin redshift material selected, you can see that it's popping up there. Now, the roughness on this I'm going to put to 0.55, and that'll just make that a lot rougher. And what I did is I sculpted this in ZBrush, and it had kind of like a blend material, and it was bringing out a lot of these sort of nice cracks and stuff that are in the skin here. So I just wanted to have a little bit of a shader that sort of replicates that, but this is a bit of a realistic shader. This is just plastic with roughness that's quite rough, and it's looking quite nice. But if we want to boost that a little bit, we can cheat a little bit by adding a bit of specular IOR here. So if we go up to 1.8, that's going to boost that sheen on that, sort of going towards a metal a little bit, but not full crazy metal. If we went up to something like 20, you'd see that that would become full metal. But we're just going up a little tiny bit to 1.8 to sort of kick that in a little bit, and we've got a pretty nice effect there. Now, if you wanted to double that and make it a lot stronger, you can even do a little cheat, and I just thought I'd show you this because it's a sculpting cheat to get sort of blend shaders, which are really fakes. They're not super realistic. We can just type the same numbers in again, and that's just going to double that intensity of that, but it sort of doesn't make it a metal and doesn't go full IOR crazy. So that's a nice little trick there. And if we were to go down a little bit on that one, we can get a little bit of a shinier sheen on that, just a little bit shinier. It's only a tiny bit shinier. And now I can bring this right down to like 0.1 or something like that on the weight, which is a bit like making this very dark. Just sort of like gives us a tiny bit of sheen there, and sometimes I really like that to keep that very low in 0.05. You can sort of A/B that with that on and off to see the difference it makes. So it's quite subtle, but we can see that we're getting a kind of a nice, we're really bringing out all the details on that sculpt there. So the last thing that we need to do is change the eye shader here. Now, if I come back in here to the camera, it's a little bit hard to see that eye because we're so far away. Now, if we are to zoom in 100% on this, you can see that we are actually rendering at full HD, but even so, I'd just like to get a little bit closer to that eye. So I'm going to go back to 50% just for the demo. I'd usually put this on a second monitor. And I'm going to do a little trick in my, this is kind of a good one to know. I've got 2 shader managers open there. Okay, so if you hold down the / key, which is below the backspace key, if you hold that down, we can use it like a bit of an alt key and zoom in. Now this is doing a 2D zoom in, not a 3D zoom in. And you'll see there's a little bit of clipping plane issues happening there. So that can be solved by coming into right click on the camera icon and just going to those middle cam clip planes there. That just fixes that up. We drag that back in again, nothing happens to the render. We're still quite far away from that render there. But if you select the camera, so you just go K for camera, that's selecting the camera in the attribute editor here. So Control A gets to that. Come all the way down, and under display options here, this is actually what we're doing. So when we click on that icon there, we are toggling that pan zoom enabled on and off. And we can simply go render pan and zoom. And what that will do is it will literally render what we can see when we're zoomed in. So now we can see that eye a little bit better. I can select that eye a bit easier now, and we can bring all the values of that eye in. So that's just updated that sort of little clipboard data here. So we grab this diffuse color now and bring that down quite dark, not all the way, but pretty dark. That should start to update, and it's a bit average kind of an eye. It's just dark now. We want to add the specular back in. So if we go 1, that will sort of give us that little bit of a reflection of the light that's there, but we want that to be a bit rougher. So I'll make it something like 0.4. It's just roughing that out a bit. And that's looking pretty good. But if we wanted it to be a little bit brighter, we can actually up the IOR. Again, it's going sort of towards a metal type of thing. But if we type in 1.8 here, so there's a little bit of a fake, you can see that getting brighter to the point if we went to something like 3, it's getting much brighter. So 1.8, we'll sort of bring that out a little bit more, and just it's a bit of a fake. We're sort of using a little bit of artistic liberty here to get that going where we want it. But now I can do that, and then back in this window, just hit backslash, and that will zoom back a bit. And we've got this nice little highlight in that eye there. And we can full screen this, and we can see that that's looking like a pretty nice render. That's pretty good there. So a nice looking render that we've got, tweaking a few little things there. And just a final sort of a heads up here is that the 128 in the render settings, when we render, if we were to do a turntable or something like that, and we were to come in and render our final frames, we would be using these settings here. Now currently we're just using that setting there. So let's have a look at this. The settings here, the unified sampling settings are these, and we haven't actually tested these yet. So we just hit this guy here. Now I know that this is pretty good because I've rendered this before, and we can see that rendering. And there's not very much noise in this image. That's all working pretty well. Now if I zoom back a little bit, we can, now that we've got a render, we could just check the framing. And for me, I think we could just be a touch lower. So just going back to interactive rendering there, just a touch lower, that's looking a little bit better framed. And now we can render that again. Redshift with 4 GPUs, super fast render there. Let's have a look at the render times of that. That's rendered in 5 seconds, so not too bad with no denoise or anything going. Redshift's pretty super speedy. So really nice render there at full HD. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you could follow along at home. And there we go, full nice looking render in Redshift.